When we talk about the economics of happiness, we have to think about not just individual happiness, but the happiness of the collective, the happiness of us as a community, of us as a country, of us as a world. So I want to start with this little mini lecture on the idea of public happiness as opposed to private happiness, and the role of government in ensuring happiness for the people. Is the role of government to make as many people happy as possible? Or is the role of government to step out and let each individual pursue happiness on their own? We're going to talk about that right here in this mini lecture. So let's start with the experiment in Bhutan. So as we watched in our mini video, the idea of, instead of measuring gross domestic product, the idea of maybe measuring gross domestic happiness originated in Bhutan. And the idea was, instead of measuring how much a country puts out in terms of things that people can buy and sell, or in terms of the amount of money that a country has, what about measuring in a more holistic sense the idea of well-being of a nation? So what they did in Bhutan was they thought about four pillars for happiness. The first was the idea of good governance and democratization. And that's really important because the idea then was that well-being came from people having a say in their government, from people having a voice in public activities. The second pillar was the idea of stable and equitable socioeconomic development. So stable development means that the country would keep growing, but in a way that wasn't too big or too small. And equitable development was the idea that as many people as possible would be able to benefit from the economic development of the country. So meaning it wouldn't just be a small group getting rich while others continued to be poor and struggling, but the idea of equity is giving people what they need to thrive, even if it's not the same amount. So the idea of raising people's standard of living, especially those who really needed it the most. The third was environmental protection. Now, this was a really interesting one because this said that to have a happy country, it needed to make sure that the country was there. There were all sorts of natural disasters in the Bhutan region, and the environmental impact of global warming and all sorts of other climate change has been really hard on the country. So thinking about environmental protection, reducing plastic, and how to have a country that thrives not just in terms of its people, but in terms of its place and space, that was something that they put on the list. And then the fourth was preservation of culture. I think this one's a particularly interesting one because it argued that the Bhutanese people had a different way of living than the folks in the West, for example, and that culture was worth really preserving and keeping strong, whether it was from how they dressed to religious traditions. And so this was the idea that well-being isn't, again, just about making money or even really being happy in the happy-go-lucky sense, but about a sort of a rich tradition, knowing where you came from and having some meaning and purpose. And meaning and purpose can often come through cultural heritage. So these four pillars embraced the idea that happiness and well-being was not just about money, right? Not just about economics, but about a holistic balance, really even pulling back into some of the stuff that the Aztecs said about the various different facets of happiness. Now, the thing was, Bhutan got a tremendous amount of publicity for this. And it was sort of held out as a model for the world. Like, shouldn't we all be measuring gross domestic happiness rather than just gross domestic product? And to a large extent, maybe we should. The challenge was that folks in Bhutan said, "Gosh, I don't know whether this is really what's happening, or whether it was just kind of a good PR pitch." So there was this article that I came across a couple of years ago from NPR that said that Bhutan's unique selling point was this idea that they were happy people. But one woman said, but the country is having difficulty living up to this brand of being such a happy country. It's expensive, it's tiring, and it's making a lot of us cynical. So this gets to the idea of, is thinking about happiness always a good thing? Is it good to be so conscious of happiness and well-being as a metric for success, that we strive to measure it on a governmental level. Should happiness be something that we focus on among individuals or in the collective? So this is one of the really big things that I want to talk to you about right now. Should happiness be something that government has a say in? Now, if we think back to some of our ancient philosophers that we talked about, Socrates really believed that collective happiness was important, and it was about shared political experience. That it was a higher order kind of happiness than individual happiness. So just like Aristotle broke it down into hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness, Socrates really saw the political happiness and collective happiness as a much higher order happiness than just being happy yourself as an individual. But today, we have a really different approach to happiness. Today, happiness is much more of an individual pursuit, right? We think about self-help. We think that our job as an individual is to make ourselves happy. And then if we can make ourselves happy, maybe we radiate that happiness out into the world, and then we can make others happy that way. But with self-help really being about individual pursuits, and our general mantra that happiness is about individual choice, right, which we've talked about, the idea of choosing to be happy, of choosing to live on purpose. And if we say that happiness is an individual choice, then it's something that we as individuals really need to think about. But then do we need to think about happiness on a collective level? So for example, is it my responsibility whether my community is happy? Would I be happier if everybody in my community were happier, or should I really just focus on myself and my own happiness? So do we need to be happy for me to be happy? Now, this is a question that we're going to come back to time and again, because it's one that I can't answer for you. It is, in fact, a fairly deep philosophical debate, but it's one I want you to think about. Should the role of government be to maximize happiness for the most number of people possible? Should we try to maximize happiness for the greatest number, or allow individuals the freedom to act to maximize their own happiness? As you might imagine, these are two very different political viewpoints and political philosophies. Now, the idea that the role of government is to make us happy, that goes back to Jeremy Bentham. And he was a political philosopher who argued the idea that, yes, in fact, the role of government is to take the science of happiness, is to figure out what makes people happy on a larger level, on a community level, and enact laws, enact subsidies, enact all sorts of supports so that people can be brought up to a base level of happiness, right? So at the very least that there is sort of like a bottom under how unhappy you can be. So Bentham believed that government should secure happiness for the greatest number of people by maximizing pleasures and minimizing pain for as many people as possible. So what Jeremy Bentham was arguing was that it really was a matter of justice. To make the largest number of people happy is actually a matter of right and wrong. It was a moral question for him. And he believed that the role of government, the moral role of government, was to make as many people happy as possible. Now, the opposite of that also has a fairly strong moral bent to it. And the opposite of that, the counter-argument to utilitarianism, is the idea that every individual has the opportunity to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So that every individual has the opportunity to maximize their own happiness. And from an individualist standpoint, there is a moral imperative there as well. I'm not telling you how to live your life. I'm not telling you what you can and can't do. We are allowing freedom for everybody to choose their own direction, to choose their own happiness. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this idea of the pursuit of happiness, especially the way it's been a little bit misinterpreted, honestly, when people talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because the American experiment was this idea of an American kind of happiness, an American response, if you will, to this idea of, is the role of government to make us happy? Should we all just leave each other alone and we all try to maximize happiness on our own? Well, the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness actually takes a kind of a joining of those ideas. So with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, the founding fathers were really kind of talking about was a different kind of happiness, not just the kind of happiness that Bentham was talking about, with making as many people happy as possible, not just the kind of happiness that you would think of in a sort of self-help manner, where it's all about making myself happy. But what the founding fathers were talking about was the idea of public happiness. And so what public happiness is experiencing public freedom and the ability to act in a group for political action. Okay, like let's start with that. That is that's a pretty strong statement, right? So I'm going to read this. I'm going to read the definition of public happiness. It's experiencing public freedom and the ability to act in a group, act as a group in political action, revolutions, and social change. Public happiness is something that happens when we create something new. Now, you might be saying, what does this have to do with happiness? What does public happiness really have to do with happiness in general? It sounds like what they're arguing for is collective action, is social justice movements, but not like the idea of making myself happy. Well, when self-help fails, we want to try social action. So public happiness is about the ability to come together as a group around ideas that are important to you and come together to make social change. Public happiness is about collective action toward happiness. It's not about the government coming in and saying we need to make people happy according to this certain rubric. No, it's about individuals figuring out what matters to them, what they want to make them happy, and then coming together as a collective to advocate for that. So if you see, it's sort of not the Bentham argument of a top-down approach to happiness. It's not the self-help of, always me, me, me on my own. Rather, it's a joining of the two, where we are saying we as individuals come together to, as a collective, to advocate for happiness around issues that we care about most. So the difference between public happiness and private happiness is that public happiness is creating something that matters to you personally through social change and political action. It's about engaging in the public sphere, right? So if the private sphere is the home, the public sphere is things outside the home, whether it is rallies, whether it's governmental action, whether it is writing an opinion piece in a newspaper, whether it is advocating, on social media for a particular idea. That's going out into the public sphere. Public happiness, according to the Founding Fathers, and really in our definition of happiness in the Aristotelian sense, public happiness is eudaimonic happiness, is the idea of thinking about someone other than yourself in terms of being happy, and it's about pro-social behavior toward happiness. Whereas private happiness is about the private accumulation of wealth and the enjoyment of wealth. It's about doing things for your own pleasure, hedonic happiness. And it's often done in the private sphere. It's also often done in terms of what makes your home nice and comfortable, about what works for your family, for you as an individual. Now, I am not saying that private happiness is wrong, nor am I saying it is wrong for you to try to maximize your private happiness. I'm simply saying that there are kind of these two definitions of private happiness and public happiness, and that the American idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, that was actually talking about public happiness as a way of, in fact, maximizing private happiness. So the idea of engaging in public happiness so that we can all have as much private happiness as possible. The wonderful quote from one of your readings for this week comes from the professor who wrote the piece. And she said, "We need to think We need to rethink the almost obsessive concern with individual happiness that pervades our culture. As Americans celebrate the revolution that gave birth to their nation, we should turn toward rediscovering the joyful emotions of birth through collective action. Let us be happy, she says. Yes, let us be happy, but publicly, politically, together. That is a call to action for all of us to think about happiness not just as hedonic happiness in the moment, but as eudaimonic happiness, as a pro-social behavior. Not just as private happiness, what works for us as individuals, but as public happiness, and about how we can take our individual beliefs and advocate for them on a public level. In an election year, this is all the more important. This is about thinking about what matters to you and what you think you want to see in your government going forward. This is about voting. This is about getting engaged and getting out there as much as you can, right? So public happiness is about taking action outside yourself. Eudaimonic happiness in action. But public happiness is really key when it comes to this economics of happiness argument. Because what we're going to continue to talk about is what is the role of money and happiness, and how does the government come in to help us or hold us back in terms of making those choices.